Okay, in chapter 4, we're going to talk about the social construction of serial murder. So, we're going to talk about some different theoretical frameworks. And for those of you that have taken either criminology or advanced crime theory, you would be familiar with some of these, although they're talking about them in a broader sense and not in quite as much detail. So, we're going to talk about first social structure theories. Now, social structure theories really focus on individual people's socioeconomic status. And these theories suggest that poor people commit more crimes because they're stifled in terms of seeking financial or social success. Things like race, ethnicity, or social standing put them in a position where they're blocked from legitimate means of achieving the American dream. So think for a minute about what the American dream means to you, right? For most people, we're talking about a home and vacations and a car and a family, right? And we have in our culture expected ways that you should achieve that. So most of you are in college probably because you want to get a good job so that you can have these things. But sometimes in society, we don't give everybody equal access to achieving that in a legitimate way. And so what happens is people may choose to try to get success through deviant means. So think, for example, about someone who chooses to sell drugs to have money to buy things. But this process doesn't really explain serial murder, right? Serial killers are not a group or a characteristic the way race or ethnicity or social standing is. But within this theory, there's a focus on this idea of urbanism. So this could provide some insights for us into serial murder. So we know that murder rates tend to be highest in densely populated cities, right? So in cities, right, we have more people in a smaller space and we have more strangers interacting with each other. Now, these urban homicide rates tend to be correlated with things like how much social disorder there is, how much alienation or isolation people feel, drugs, fear, poverty, etc. Now, highly dense populations also increase the likelihood of victimization because we come into contact with strangers on a daily basis. So think about the fact that you're all attending school in the city of Boston, right? Boston has the most college students per capita of anywhere else in the US, right? So high amount of strangers. You certainly don't know everybody even on campus, right? And it's easier for us to victimize strangers because we don't feel as bad about it. Now, since World War II, homicide rates in the US have remained significantly higher than homicide rates in other industrialized societies. Now, a large part of that is because of our availability of guns here. But also, high density populations are attractive to people who want to blend into their environments. So, this would maybe help explain why we tend to see serial killers in urban areas. Now, another class of theories is social class theories. And Leighton notes that serial killers are often on the margins of society, right on the margins of upper working class, lower middle class, and they might often feel excluded from this group that they wish to be part of. Caputi mentions that females are often victims of serial killers because of their powerlessness, that serial killing is potentially rooted in a system of male dominance, with serial murder being the ultimate expression and the ultimate form of dominant power. Now, Egger notes that the majority of victims share common characteristics that again tend to make them powerless, right? Characteristics or occupations or situations that leave them without power or prestige. So, women who are poor, prostitutes, homeless folks, minorities, and elderly folks. Now, social process theories talk about criminal behavior as a form of socialization. Basically, everybody has the potential to become a criminal. And family and our socialization are going to play a really strong role in who ends up engaging in delinquent and violent behavior. So, for instance, parents who divorce have children with higher levels of externalizing behavior. That means they tend to take their anger and frustration out on other people instead of on themselves. They tend to have a decline in academic achievement and greater problems maintaining healthy relationships. But these problems mitigate over time. Over time, they disappear. And for most folks, this doesn't have any long term effects. And in all likelihood, it's not that your parents' divorce that led to this situation, but probably the same things that led to the divorce also led to these other also led to higher levels of externalizing behavior, etc. One thing we do want to pay attention to, though, is the experiences that children have with being victims and being witnesses to violent behavior, because the social learning of aggression may be very subtle. And another thing to think about is children who end up in total institutions. So that could be, generally, if we think about it, it would be like residential treatment or the juvenile justice system. They may experience routine degradation in these institutions. Now, neutralization theory argues that teens drift in and out of delinquent and conventional behavior. Um, that people who are breaking the law are not always breaking the law. Now, why do people break laws that they believe in? So, for instance, why do kids who think it's wrong to hit people sometimes hit people? Right? Well, one thing they might do is neutralize their behavior, neutralize their rationalizations, rationalize their bad behavior. Okay. Now, your book just talks about 5, although this wheel has more than that. It has 8. But the most common ones are denying responsibility, saying something is not your fault, denying any injury, they're so rich they'll never miss it, appealing to higher loyalties. I had to defend my sister. We have to protect ourselves. Condemn the condemners, they're worse than we are, and deny the victim. I only beat up drunks. Now, if we think about this, denial of the victim is really something that could play a role here with serial killers, especially serial killers who tend to target people that they feel are less than, right? So if a serial killer is targeting prostitutes, they've often dehumanized those victims. They don't even see them as people, right? So nobody's getting hurt. There's no real victim here. They deserve what they got. Now, one thing about neutralization theory is that it's pretty hard to verify. How do we prove or show that you neutralized your behavior before you did something as opposed to attacking and killing prostitutes and then justifying your behavior after the fact? Now, social control theory takes a unique approach. Instead of looking for reasons why people break the law, they assume everyone has the potential and capacity to break the law. So, how come some people don't break the law? And that would be because of their bond to society. And this bond is made up of 4 elements: attachment, commitment, involvement, and belief. So, attachment, these are your shared interests, your attachment to other people. If you really stop and think about why don't you break the law, right? Sure, of course, none of us want to go to jail or prison. But most of us are probably more worried about how we would disappoint or let down other people, right? That's that attachment piece of that bond. Now, commitment and involvement kind of go together, right? How much time and energy we put into conforming activities. So think about you guys, you're involved in school. You probably have jobs. You may be playing on sports teams. You may be volunteering at places, right? You have a lot of commitments and you spend a lot of time at those commitments, okay? You have something to lose. And then beliefs are shared value and moral systems. Now, one thing that you're going to see as we get into other chapters, right, is that most serial killers do not have good attachments. They don't have close bonds with their families, right? A lot of what we're seeing here is these really negative and traumatic home environments. But this theory is really about juveniles and not about adults. And finally, our last theory we're going to look at is labeling theory. And labeling theory became popular in the 60s, and it's really talking about the stigma that occurs once we've been labeled as something bad. Okay. Now, we're going to talk about it in terms of being labeled as a criminal or an offender, but it could be other things. Now, all the deviance we engage in up until we get labeled as a deviant person, right, is considered primary deviance. Now, labeling theory is looking at how does labeling you as an offender, a convict, a murderer, how does that impact your subsequent behavior? And labeling theory says that for some people, they really adopt that status, right? They really internalize it, and then they continue to behave badly because they've internalized that label. Now, some people are more likely to be labeled than others. All you have to do is look at, a few stories that are happening in the news and think about who is behaving badly and not being labeled. And who is being labeled that maybe isn't behaving as badly. So it is the very end of December 2021 as I'm recording this, and Ghislaine Maxwell was just found guilty on 5 of the 6 charges of trafficking in a minor. Right now, Jeffrey Epstein hasn't really been held accountable because he died by suicide while in prison. And Ghislaine Maxwell has now just been held accountable, as she should be, right? But there's many rich and powerful men that are alleged to have been connected to this trafficking of minors. And if you're unaware of this, this case, do yourself a favor and Google it. There's also a good Netflix documentary called Filthy Rich, I believe. It's about Jeffrey Epstein. And they haven't been labeled yet, right? So no negative consequences seem to be happening to them. Now, the key thing with labeling theory is to remember that there's nothing intrinsic about bad behavior that makes it bad behavior, right? It's the fact that we decide it's deviant that makes it deviant. And so we're not concerned about the origins of serial killers' behavior, but how their perceived status, once they take on a master status, a status that affects everything that you do, right? That affects your whole worldview. So think about something like your gender is a master status, okay? It really impacts everything about your life. How does the adoption of this master status, as a result of traumatic events in your childhood, how does that impact your future behavior? Now, a couple things to keep in mind, right? Roth did a study in 2013 looking at homicide rates and said that the homicide rates don't really correlate well with social factors like income, unemployment, prison populations, household gun ownership, police presence, or rates of substance abuse, right? So if we think about it, when we think about it, right, most homicides, let's step away from serial killings for a moment, but most homicides, right, are the result of a dispute. So there are fundamental facilitators or deterrents to homicide, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But let's talk first about juvenile offenders, right? And I want to remind you that your book keeps referring to examples of mass murderers and profiling folks that are not actually serial killers, right? I don't want you to focus on those pieces, right? So in this case, we've got a story of a student going into a school, wielding kitchen knives, and attempting to, slashing and stabbing 21 fellow students, right? So this is a mass murder, not a serial murder. Now, less than 10% of all homicides in the US are committed by juveniles, folks under the age of 18. But when juveniles do commit murder, they often come from abusive family backgrounds. They've often witnessed a lot of violence and or were recipients of abuse themselves. Now, most juveniles who kill, as is the case with actually most homicide offenders, right? Most homicide offenders don't commit another homicide. And most juveniles who kill are apprehended, incarcerated, and once released, also do not kill again. But what about those that do? So your text first talks about this study that Myers did that technically isn't a typology of serial killers, but Myers did study 16 juvenile killers who had committed a sexual homicide, right? So these are kids that we would be concerned about potentially becoming serial offenders. And he found 4 categories. Now, I want you to keep in mind that he studied 16 juveniles, okay? That's really not enough to make a typology of 4 different types. So take this with a grain of salt. He said that some offenders were explosive. They had repressed feelings of sexual aggression with a desire to dominate and destroy families, while others were predatory, hunting and stalking their prey. Some were revenge killers, killing out of anger towards people they knew who they believe had wronged them. And others were displaced matricide. So they lived near victims and attacks had evidence of control and rage. Right now, displaced matricide would imply that what they really do want to do is kill their mother, and they're killing somebody else instead, who kind of serves as a substitute. Now, Myers did study 6 juvenile serial killers. So again, this gives us some ideas, but it's 6 killers, right? So we can't really take this information and generalize it to juvenile serial killers. Each of the 6 cases did have a sexual component, And most often the offender killed by stabbing, cutting, or strangling, right? So asphyxiation. The majority tortured their victims, half masturbated at the scene, and or mutilated their victims. Most had personality and conduct disorders, evidence of sexual sadism, and psychopathic traits. Now, I want you to pay attention to that bullet point because we're going to see this over and over and over again with these serial killers, right? Personality disorders and conduct disorders. And remember, personality disorders do not qualify for insanity, and conduct disorder is basically what we label a juvenile who has evidence of psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder, but we do not diagnose minors with ASPD or psychopathy. Sexual sadism is paraphilia and psychopathic traits. More than half recidivated in 4 years. Those who reoffended had higher PCLR scores, right? So that's that measure that we're using of psychopathy. And about a quarter of those who were released did evolve into sexual serial murderers, which is why even if you have a juvenile who has not committed multiple murders yet, but you're seeing some of these concerning elements, we want to be more concerned about that minor. Now, the Kirby study has developed a typology for juvenile serial killers. They examined 27 juvenile serial killers. Again, still a small population, but much better for a study. Only one was female. And they found 3 different types. So primary juvenile offenders generally murdered 1 victim at a time and had killed 2 victims by the time they were 18. About half of them were white. About 45% raised by both parents, and about 30% had some childhood trauma. 85% had histories of violence, and 42% had an arrest prior to their first kill. Their victims ranged in ages from 3 to 83. A little more than half had a sexual component, and 61% killed in a private location, so somebody's home, generally speaking. Now, the second group is maturing juvenile offenders. They also have their first victim prior to age 18. Obviously, that's what makes them a juvenile serial killer. And all their other victims prior to the age of 21. All of these offenders were white males, and they had about 2 to 3 victims each. About 40% killed at night, about half in a home, and 1 in 4 staged their crime scene, right? That's some fairly sophisticated behavior from minors. Their primary motive was sexual, and over 60% of the victims were strangers. None of them were incarcerated between their kills. And finally, we have these secondary juvenile offenders. Again, first victim prior to age 18, and the rest after age 21. All of these were men, half were white. Again, 2 to 3 victims each. But these folks were mostly not sexually motivated, although 1 in 5 victims did have genital mutilation. Their first kill occurred between the ages of 14 and 16. Now, they, compared to the other groups, had less trauma, were more likely to be raised by both parents, and had less history of violence. And over 70% of them killed in a public location. Okay, now one thing that often gets talked about is the homicidal triad or the McDonald triad. Okay. And serial killers, and sometimes people link homicide in general to these 3 elements, okay, or 3 behaviors: the torture of animals, chronic bedwetting, and fire setting. Now, the McDonald triad's not a good predictor of, what kind of behavior you're going to engage in as an adult, but certainly we should be concerned about anybody who is exhibiting these, especially if they're exhibiting all 3 of these behaviors. It does create a pattern of creating hurt because of hurt, right? So someone who was hurt is now hurting other people. The person who was victimized has now become the victimizer. So as I mentioned, it's not a great predictor, and it's not really a way that we measure any sort of future violence, but there is a correlation between youth that engage in these or have these behaviors. They do appear more often amongst the serial killer population. At a minimum, this is a sign that a child is troubled. In particular, cruelty to animals and fire setting, if these are behaviors you see in a child, they absolutely need some type of mental health intervention. So let's talk about cruelty to animals. I had a client once on probation who told us how he once was on like the second floor porch in a double-decker house, and he took a cat and he swung the cat by its tail until the cat separated from the tail and the cat went flying. I had another client tell me how um, he liked going on community service because they would give them those pointy sticks to pick up trash, and he would use it to stab wild rabbits. Right? This is obviously concerning things for teenagers to be telling you they enjoy doing. So, what are reasons for abusing animals? Sometimes it's to control or retaliate against the animal. Sometimes it's to express aggression or enhance one's own aggression. Sometimes it's to shock people. I'm sure sharing those stories is an attempt to get myself and other staff to be like, oh my God. It's displacement of hostility. It could be retaliating against a person if that animal is a pet belonging to another person. Now, bedwetting's a little different. Enuresis is the unintentional bedwetting during sleep that's persistent after the age of 5, right? So when kids are little, we expect them to have accidents in bed. But this can also be a sign of previous trauma, okay? Now, it evokes a lot of distress, right, and emotion. It's obviously embarrassing for the person who is wetting the bed. Parents find it annoying because they are consistently being woken up in the middle of the night. But about 80% of these cases have a biological root. It's often hereditary. Could be like problems with your muscles that inhibit urination. Could be a hormonal imbalance, right? Those are medical situations that you can clear up. But about 20% of the time, it's a red flag for something more serious. Now, keep in mind, enuresis is not a behavior we can control, whereas we can't control hurting animals or setting fires, right? If you're asleep, you don't really control your body, right? It's unconscious, involuntary, and it's nonviolent. So linking it to violent crime is problematic. We don't want to use this as a predictor for anything, other than, if you are a mental health counselor and you've got a client who's over 5 who's continuing to wet the bed, you might want to explore what's going on there. Now, fire setting is very concerning, okay? When we talk about juveniles, we refer to it as fire setting. When it's adults, we refer to it as arson. And some kids have an abnormal fascination with fire. They want to watch fire, play with fire. They might like to pull false alarms. And about a little more than half of all arsons are set by juveniles. Overwhelmingly, it is boys. So more than 90%, or just about 90%. Now, our author did a study of juvenile fire setters in Fresno and found that there was some common family issues. Right now, remember, this is a study just in one area. Low marital satisfaction in the home, little to no display of affection, ineffectual role modeling, and excessive physical form of discipline. So, physically disciplining your children. Now, there's some common psychobehavioral problems we see in juvenile fire setters, often issues in school, issues learning, behavior, poor concentration, a lot of lying and excessive anger, attention seeking, again, that preoccupation with fire. I had a client once who said to me, I really love to set fires. That's a little concerning. He had also set his parents' porch on fire, so obviously concerning. Um, So if there's ever a kid in your life that is setting fires, that's something we want to get them some mental health intervention quickly. Now, there's 2 types of fire setters that we can see some perhaps linkage or common traits with serial killers. So one is the cry for help fire setters, right? They may be trying to bring attention to themselves, right? These are the kind of people who set fires and then kind of rush in to be the hero, help extinguish it. And then delinquent or antisocial fire setters don't have a lot of empathy or remorse, and they have a lot of psychopathology rooted in family dynamics, right? So again, family issues. Now, in this study of juvenile fire setters in Fresno, there was a lot of parental absenteeism. The fire setters were also more frequently spanked, and they reported bad experiences at home. Now, fire setting does appear to be transitory, okay? So while pretty much all adult fire setters have a history of setting fires when they were minors, most minors who set fires do not continue setting fires into adulthood. But again, it's something you absolutely want to have looked at. Now, we know that serial killing is cyclical, right? So offenders kind of go through a cycle of behavior that they repeat over and over again with each victim. So your book talks about this trauma control model, okay? And that probably what's happening is serial killers have these fantasies, right? These fantasies might be fueled by pornography or alcohol. They might be reinforced by trauma that happens to them on a daily basis. And it keeps them caught up in the self perpetuating cycle of fantasy stalking violence. Fantasy stalking violence. Okay, and your book kind of lays out some things for us, right? So one set of things we want to think of are traumas that might predispose us, right? So again, not everyone who experiences trauma is going to go on to become a serial killer, right? But many serial killers have experienced trauma. And then what are things that might help facilitate this behavior? So that's again fantasies, it can be alcohol, it can be pornography, etc. Now, a big issue for serial killers is rejection in their childhood. Um, Rejection by relatives, rejection by parents. Okay. So, an unstable, abusive home is one of the major forms of rejection, right? And if you think about each of these serial killers you've seen profiled so far in your textbook, right, we see this in their backgrounds. And as I mentioned, certain things might help facilitate that. Alcohol tends to decrease our inhibitions. Pornography, especially deviant, violent, abusive pornography, fuels fantasies of violence. Not all pornography, right? I want to be clear that we're not saying that, like, if you watch pornography, something is wrong with you. Some serial killers, though, have really talked about how pornography played a very key role in their behavior. Um, but for others, pornography may serve as a release valve, lessening a demand for victims. Now, finally, a thing that we often hear is like, does the media play a role in this, right? Video games don't cause people to become violent, right? And violent video games, violent movies do not cause people to be violent. However, people with violent fantasies might be drawn to these types of video games or movies. Um, and so, that may reinforce some of that behavior or some of those fantasies, rather.